There is a fir tree planted near the gate of Paul McCartney's home in England, a gift George Harrison once gave him. McCartney has said that whenever he walks past it, he quietly says hello to his old friend. It's a small ritual, almost private, but says more about the bond between these two men than any headline ever could. Their story runs from a school bus in 1950s Liverpool to a hospital room in New York decades later, and holds nearly everything two people can go through together. Hero worship, mentorship, jealousy, artistic rivalry, estrangement, and finally, something like peace. Paul McCartney and George Harrison first crossed paths as schoolboys at the Liverpool Institute for Boys, a strict, uniformed grammar school that neither of them particularly loved. McCartney was a year ahead, already known for his sharp wit and his obvious talent for music. Harrison was younger, quieter, and by his own later admission, miserable in that rigid environment. What brought them together wasn't the classroom. It was the bus ride into the city center, where school rules loosened and conversation turned naturally toward guitars and records. George noticed Paul carrying a guitar case one day, and that was enough to start a friendship that would eventually reshape popular music. Both boys were caught up in the skiffle craze sweeping Britain in the mid-1950s, a scrappy, homemade style of music that convinced a generation of teenagers they could form bands with almost nothing but enthusiasm and a few chords. They idolized the same American records, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, and traded notes on technique the way other kids traded football cards. Harrison, in particular, became obsessive about the guitar, sketching instruments in his school notebooks and practicing until his fingers ached. McCartney, whose father had led a jazz band in the 1920s, grew up with music in the house and had a head start on piano and guitar both. He recognized something in George's dedication early on, and the 2-year age gap between them, which might have kept other boys apart, simply didn't matter once the music took over. By 1957, McCartney had joined John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen, and when the band needed another guitarist, Paul thought immediately of George. Lennon wasn't convinced at first. He thought Harrison looked too young and too baby-faced for the group. The story goes that George settled the argument the practical way, auditioning on the top deck of a Liverpool bus by playing a note-perfect version of the instrumental Raunchy. Lennon couldn't argue with playing like that, and Harrison was in. With that, the core of what would become the Beatles was complete, and Paul had effectively vouched for George at the moment that mattered most, cementing his early role as George's champion and, in many ways, his mentor. The years that followed were formative in ways that went beyond music. McCartney had lost his mother to cancer when he was 14, and the friendships within the group offered him both companionship and a sense of purpose. For Harrison, being accepted by older, more experienced musicians was its own kind of validation, proof that he belonged. The three of them spent countless hours teaching each other chords, scribbling half-finished songs, and imagining a future that reached well beyond Liverpool's docks and terraced houses. It was a genuine brotherhood, built before any of them had reason to expect fame, which is partly why what came later stung so much. As Beatlemania swept the world in the early 1960s, the dynamic inside the band began to shift. What had started as a trio of equals slowly reorganized itself around Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership, with Harrison increasingly positioned as the quiet one, the guitarist who executed other people's visions rather than the songwriter with his own. McCartney, meanwhile, became the band's most driven creative force in the studio, pushing for ambitious arrangements and demanding a level of polish that not everyone in the room wanted to chase. That drive produced extraordinary music, but it also crowded out space for Harrison's own ideas, and the difference in status became harder to ignore the bigger the band got. Nowhere was that imbalance clearer than during the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. The album was largely McCartney's concept from start to finish, a record built to reinvent what a rock album could be. For Harrison, the sessions underlined just how little room remained for his own contributions. His one composition on the record, Within You Without You, reflected the immersion in Indian philosophy and music he'd been pursuing for years, and it stood apart from everything else on the album, not just musically, but emotionally. To McCartney, it was one more interesting track on an ambitious project. To Harrison, it was personal in a way the rest of the record wasn't, and that gap in how seriously each of them took his spiritual direction would only widen. That gap became obvious during the Beatles' trip to India in 1968, when the group studied meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Harrison approached it as something close to a spiritual awakening. McCartney, by his own later account, treated it more as an interesting diversion, and reportedly joked with George at the time to lighten the mood, a joke Harrison, by most accounts, did not find especially funny. For George, the band's preoccupation with records, business, and fame felt like exactly the kind of distraction he was trying to escape. That basic mismatch in priorities, McCartney driving the group's direction, Harrison increasingly frustrated at being sidelined both musically and spiritually, set the tone for the tension that would define the last years of the Beatles. By 1969, the strain was no longer something the four of them could paper over in interviews. The sessions for what became Let It Be were filmed, and the cameras caught what insiders already knew. McCartney frequently directed the others in the studio, and Harrison, in particular, chafed under it. At one low point, George reportedly told Paul he'd play whatever was wanted of him, or not play at all, a line that captured years of frustration in a single exhausted sentence. By then, Harrison had quietly built up a real catalog of songs, tracks that would eventually surface as All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill, but inside the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney's material still got priority, and much of Harrison's writing simply went unheard. On January 10, 1969, in the middle of rehearsals, Harrison walked out of the sessions entirely. He later said staying had become genuinely unhealthy for him. Lennon had talked about quitting before, but George's actual departure rattled the group in a different way, forcing the others to realize how essential he'd become, not just as a guitarist, but as part of the fragile chemistry that held the band together. He returned about 12 days later, and the group patched things up enough to keep working, but the underlying cracks didn't disappear. One song Harrison wrote on the very day he quit, Wah Wah, reportedly captured exactly how suffocating he'd found the environment McCartney had helped create around him. Around this same period, McCartney privately acknowledged to Lennon that Harrison's songwriting had caught up with theirs, a striking admission from a man who'd spent years positioning himself and John as the band's primary writers. Harrison, for his part, waved off any suggestion that this was some sudden late bloom. He maintained he'd been writing at that level for years and simply hadn't been given the chance to prove it. The resentment cut in both directions. McCartney saw George as someone who'd taken a long time to find his voice, while Harrison saw Paul as someone unwilling to make room for anyone else's. That frustration eventually made its way directly into Harrison's music. On Run of the Mill, from his 1970 solo album, All Things Must Pass, he wrote pointedly about losing a friendship, lines that were hard to read as anything other than a message aimed squarely at Paul. Even amid all that friction, 1969 also gave Harrison his most significant vindication yet. When the Beatles recorded Abbey Road, it was George who delivered two of the album's most enduring songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Frank Sinatra would later call Something one of the greatest love songs ever written, and Lennon himself admitted it was the best track on the record. For Harrison, after years of feeling overlooked, that was real recognition. For McCartney, it was a signal that the balance of power within the band was shifting in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. Behind the scenes, George still resented Paul's habit of reworking other people's arrangements, while Paul believed George's ideas often needed more shaping than George wanted to give them. The sessions were professional, productive, and musically extraordinary, but the warmth between the two of them was mostly gone by the time the album came out in September 1969. The Beatles' breakup became official the following year, and both men moved quickly into solo careers that doubled as a kind of scoreboard. Harrison released the sprawling triple album, All Things Must Pass, in late 1970, and its depth and maturity stunned listeners who'd underestimated him for a decade. McCartney released his self-titled solo debut around the same time, and soon after formed Wings, building a different kind of commercial career on his own terms. The rivalry didn't disappear with the band. If anything, it just found a new stage, with each man effectively proving he didn't need the other three to succeed. Their relationship through the 1970s was, by most accounts, sporadic and often cool. Harrison was candid in interviews about finding McCartney overpowering, at one point suggesting he'd happily work with Lennon again, but had no interest in doing the same with Paul. McCartney tended to shrug these comments off publicly, though those close to him have suggested privately they stung more than he let on. There were gestures toward reconciliation along the way. Harrison invited Paul to perform at the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, a landmark benefit show, but McCartney declined, citing practical concerns, and the absence didn't help close the distance between them. For much of the decade, they moved in different directions, Harrison deepening his spiritual life and solo work, McCartney chasing commercial success with a relentlessness that had defined him since his teens. Whatever bitterness lingered, though, there remained a shared history neither of them could simply walk away from, and that thread eventually pulled them back together. By the early 1990s, enough time had passed for some of the old anger to soften. On February 11, 1994, McCartney, Harrison, and Ringo Starr reunited at Paul's studio to work on unfinished demo recordings John Lennon had left behind before his death. The press quickly dubbed the trio the Threedles, and for a generation of fans it felt like something long thought lost had come back to life. But old habits didn't vanish overnight. Harrison arrived with firm opinions, insisting that producer Jeff Lynne handle the sessions rather than letting the three of them work it out alone, reportedly warning Paul that without an outside hand, things could get chaotic fast, given the size of the personalities involved. McCartney later credited George with the instinct to bring in a producer rather than risk it. The sessions produced 2 new tracks built from Lennon's old demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love, and even here the two men's differing instincts showed. McCartney wanted the songs to sound unmistakably like the Beatles. Harrison pushed for something simpler and closer to his own melodic sensibility. They disagreed over guitar solos, lyrics, and even what the reunion itself was supposed to represent. Somehow, the work got finished, and the results became a genuine bridge back to their shared past. Outside the studio, George remained fairly blunt about his feelings. He still described Paul as overpowering, and said he couldn't picture being in another band with him. McCartney, meanwhile, had grown more willing to say publicly what he'd once been slow to admit, that he had underestimated George as a songwriter in their younger years, and that Harrison had gone on to write some of the greatest songs in the group's catalog. As the decade wore on, Harrison's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, and treatment for that was later followed by struggles with lung cancer and, eventually, a brain tumor. In 1999, he survived a violent knife attack at his home in Friar Park, an ordeal that left him physically shaken even as it seemed to deepen his spiritual resolve rather than diminish it. McCartney visited when he could during these years, and by most accounts, whatever distance had defined earlier decades kept narrowing as George's health worsened. The old rivalries that had once felt so consuming started to look smaller next to the reality of mortality. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, after his long fight with cancer. He was 58 years old, a lifelong smoker whose final years had been marked by illness and gradual decline. In keeping with his Hindu beliefs, his ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers. For McCartney, the loss went far beyond losing a bandmate. It was the death of someone he'd known since he was a teenager on a school bus, someone who had, in a real sense, grown up alongside him. In a 2008 interview, McCartney described one of his last visits with Harrison in a New York hospital roughly 10 days before George died. He recalled sitting with him for hours, the two of them joking around like they were kids again, an experience he described as feeling almost like a dream. At one point they held hands, something McCartney noted would have been unthinkable between two Liverpool lads in their younger years, when that kind of open affection simply wasn't done. He called George my little baby brother, almost, a line that has since become one of the most quoted things McCartney has ever said about his old friend, precisely because it captures so plainly what decades of rivalry never managed to erase. The day after Harrison's death, McCartney faced reporters and, visibly searching for the right words, called George a lovely man and a very brave one, adding that he believed history would remember him as a great man in his own right. In the years since, McCartney has found small, private ways to keep that connection alive. He's spoken more than once about the fir tree George gave him, planted near his gate, and about the habit of quietly greeting it, "Hi, George," whenever he passes. In a 2020 interview, McCartney also reflected on Harrison's love of gardening and horticulture, noting that George's spirit still feels present in aspects of his own life decades later. The bond didn't end with their generation, either. George's son, Donnie, and Paul's daughter, Stella, have remained close over the years, supporting one another through their respective careers. Donnie, a musician carrying on his father's legacy. Stella, a fashion designer who has spoken warmly of the friendship between the two families. It's a small but telling detail. Whatever tension defined the working relationship between Paul and George at various points, the affection underneath, it was real enough to pass down to their children without the baggage attached. Looking back across the whole arc of it, the school bus in Liverpool, the audition on the top deck, the mentorship, the creative competition, the walkout, the solo years, the guarded reunion, and finally the hospital room, what stands out isn't that Paul McCartney and George Harrison fought. Most people who work that closely together for that long do. What stands out is that neither of them ever fully let go of what they'd been to each other before any of it started. Two teenagers on a bus, talking about guitars, with no idea what they were about to build together.